Okay, good morning, everyone. So this is the 16th webinar of PAASE. So again, PAASE is the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering. And this is an organization which consists of scientists and engineers of Philippine descent based in the Philippines and in the United States. But now we have other members from other countries as well. So thank you for joining us this morning. So we will begin with a webinar in a few seconds. To our viewers on YouTube, you please feel free to type in any questions you might have for the panel. So good morning, it's 8 o'clock. So we will now begin with our webinar. So today is a special session for the PAASE webinar because we don't have just one speaker. We actually have a panel of speakers, but I will let our first speaker introduce the rest of the team um, in his talk. So our speaker is a professor of chemical engineering and a university fellow at De La Salle University and an academician of the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology. So for those of you who have been watching us and joining us in our past webinars, you probably know him already. So I will let him introduce the rest of the team and the rest of the project. So without further ado, may I call on Professor Raymond Tan.
Thank you, Dr. K. Good morning, everyone. Let me just begin by sharing my screen. All right, good morning once again. Our talk is in Malaysia and the Philippines. My name is Raymond Tan. With me this morning, we have colleagues who are part of the research team, Professor Denny Ang of Heriot-Watt University, and our team economist, Dr. Krista Daniel Yu, will also be making brief work that involves three universities. Heriot-Watt University is the lead university. De La Salle University is the Philippine partner, and the University of Nottingham, the Malaysia campus, is also involved. And the non-academic partner is the Young Scientists Network of Malaysia, which is under the ASM, the Academy Science Malaysia. All right, seem to be having some technical difficulties. Let me sort this out first. All right, let me introduce the members of the research team. The project is led by Dr. Viknesh Andiyapan Murugapan, who's at Heriot-Watt University. In the Heriot-Watt team is Professor Denny Ang, who will be making his part of the presentation about the Malaysian data. And their postdoc, Dr. Steve Fu, Dr. Nishant Chamandatuvalabil, and my colleagues from the Philippines, our host, Professor Kay Aviso and Dr. Krista Daniel Yu. The project is funded under the Heriot-Watt University's GCRF fund. There was a COVID call several months ago, and we secured a grant for a 2.5-month project to look at optimizing lockdown exit strategies and doing a comparative analysis of the Philippines and of Malaysia. And in particular, we had two things in mind. We had to look at the different sectors that comprise both economies, and we decided to zoom in particularly on the agro-industry sectors by looking at major commodity crops in both countries. And we decided, well, in the case of Malaysia, there's oil palm and the associated downstream industries, and in the Philippines, of course, coconut, and likewise the downstream industries. And we used economic modeling techniques coupled with operations research to develop recovery strategies for both countries. If you wish to know more about the project, this QR code will lead you to a link which is on the website of Heriot-Watt University with a bit more description. And of course, eventually we expect a paper to be published, both the methodology that we developed and the application to the case of the Philippines, and a brief summary of what's happening in Malaysia using the same modeling techniques, because it may be possible to glean insights by looking at common features of both countries and likewise looking at what is different between the two countries. Now, COVID-19 has taken the world by storm. Initially, there was plenty of worry just about the clinical and health issues. After 4 or 5 months, people are starting to worry about the economic impacts, as well we should, because there are going to be impacts on individual economic sectors and on the livelihoods of people. And thus, if we look at agro-industrial supply chains in both countries, it's essential that we try to figure out the optimal recovery strategies that can be applied by figuring out the priority rank of the different sectors. How important are they to the rest of the economy? And how to optimize any stimulus package which may be available in limited amount. So I'll talk next about the Philippine economy, which had been on such a nice upward trajectory.
Okay, it seems like we have lost Raymond for a while there. Okay, maybe we can just wait a bit. Raymond, you seem to be on mute.
Okay. Okay, I'm back. Just a minor technical glitch. So that 6% plus annual growth rate that we're expecting to continue into this decade has been interrupted by this pandemic. Okay, I suppose okay. The technique that we used in this work is known as input-output analysis. It's a mainstream tool in economics, which was developed by Vasily Leontiev, a Nobel laureate who won the prize specifically for developing this technique. And the input-output analysis is based on a network model of an economic system. So on screen, we see a low resolution representation of a hypothetical economy consisting of agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And on the right hand of the screen is the economic output which goes to final consumption, or the purchases by actual households, physical goods or services. This is a low resolution input-output model. Conceptually, this can be applied at any arbitrary level of resolution. So for instance, there are developed countries wherein this is done at the level of having 400, 500 individual boxes or sectors which are linked in a network like this. The consequences of the linkage are that the sectors, when the sectors are disrupted, these disruptions ripple through the network and can affect downstream and upstream sectors. And you could imagine, for example, if you have a drop in restaurant patronage because of the pandemic, then you would have resulting supply chain effects on the suppliers of the restaurant, which provide the food, the packaging, the detergents, and whatever else they need to purchase for normal operations. And this sort of cascade effect ripples through an economic system. And it's important to have a model because many of these ripple effects are not immediately evident just by direct observation. You'd have to actually calculate those effects, especially if they're second, third, fourth degree effects. Okay. What we've done is we had to settle on a degree of resolution which was fine enough that we would get some reasonable insights, but also it would not have done to have hundreds of sectors represented in a webinar such as this. So we thought 16 would be a reasonable size. What we also did was we disaggregated 4 manufacturing sectors which are linked to coconut oil, refining of coconut oil, and production of downstream derivatives. So that then left us with manufacturing of all other products being aggregated still into a large composite sector, which is number 8 on screen. So these are data based on official Philippine statistics.
Raymond, would you want, I can share the slides on my end so that you can just do the talk.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, I need to stop sharing.
Okay, I hope that you can see the slides now. Okay, just let me know when to proceed.
Okay, thanks. What we also did was we revisited a technique for criticality analysis, which we developed about 6 years ago. And we thought that there should be a way to rank different economic sectors in terms of how important they are, both for themselves and for the rest of the economy. And the initial work we had in 2014 had 3 criteria: economic impact, connectivity, and sector size. And of course, we called it vulnerability index in the original paper. We realized criticality is a much more appropriate and more descriptive term. And we added for this installment the income multiplier and employment effects of these different sectors. And if we proceed to the next, okay, on the right-hand side of the slide, we have the updated sector criticality index, or SEI, which is a 5-component index of how important the sectors are. And we then include weights, which are normalized to sum up to unity and initially assume equal weighting of these components. So that's 0.2 for each of them. We also did a panel survey. We took 11 experts from academia, government, and industry in both countries. And we conducted a survey on how important each of these 5 components are. And they came up with weightings which are shown at the bottom of the screen, which, as you will see, are slightly different from the initial assumption of equal weights. So if we go to the next slide, we were able to calculate the SEI values of the 16 economic sectors, which are shown here. The colored bands represent the 5 components. So you can see the next thing we can do is rank these sectors from the most critical to the least critical, which is shown in the next slide. So that's exactly the same data, but now ranked from highest to lowest. And you would see then the data that's shown here represents how critical each of these sectors is relative to the economic system. And manufacturing sector, which is highlighted, if you would click, okay, that's the most important sector because of its size, because of its not so much the employment size and the economic impact. Now, the sectors that we were interested in specifically in terms of the agro-industrial coconut supply chain are ranked much lower. The coconut farming sector is ranked in the middle of the pack, just above the midpoint. And of course, those downstream manufacturing sectors that rely primarily on coconut as input. Sector 7, 4, and 5 and 6 are ranked much lower. In the next slide, we would then see a visualization of SEI, and by using a radar chart like this, you can get a visual sense of the contributions of the 5 components to the SEI composite score of these different sectors. And of course, the rankings are the same, but the size of those polygons give an index, a very rough visual representation of the SEI values. If we proceed to the next slide, we would then see that the 4 downstream industrial sectors that are linked to the coconut industry are ranked relatively low in criticality. Right, next slide, please. If we revisit the same data, of course, the weights that we assign to the 5 components of the SEI influence the rankings that we derive. And we would look at these and we can see the diamonds and the X's represent the rankings that we get if we use the equal weighting assumption, or if we were to use the assumptions of weights based on the 11 experts that were surveyed. And there really isn't much of a difference that arises from that. It's more interesting to do Monte Carlo simulation. What we did was we looked at how the indices would vary if we were to simulate different weighting values. And that results in an error bar, which gives you a range of how much the SEI value of each sector might change if the priorities shift. Say, if you were to put more value towards employment or such. And the way to read this chart is, as when you look at data with error bars, it's important to look at the midpoints, which represent the point estimates of the SEIs of these sectors. But looking at the margins, the upper bounds and lower bounds would give you the extent of overlap. And for example, I direct your attention to the last 4 sectors ranked utilities, sector 10, petroleum refineries, 6, manufacture of refined coconut oil is 5, and real estate, 14. These are the bottom sectors ranked from 13 through 16. But if you inspect closely the margins or the possible variations in value, there's significant overlap. So the actual rankings, you might as well call it a tie for these last 4 because there's so much overlap, you can't really say that one is much more critical than the other. The differences in score are minute compared to the overlaps. Next slide, please. Still, of course, the composite aggregated manufacturing sector is still the most critical, even when we take into account the margins. And those involving coconut, not so much. Right, next slide, please. Now, a little bit about the pandemic in the Philippines, I just learned that in terms of statistically, in terms of active cases, we're now at close to 40,000. In terms of cumulative cases, it's over 60,000. And there have been, of course, as in many countries throughout the world, efforts to stem the spread of the virus through lockdown measures, which were very strict early on, but there's been recognition more recently that the lockdowns need to be calibrated because it needs to be sustained for a longer period than was initially believed. So if we proceed to the next slide, the national lockdown, of course, comes in different levels. There's GCQ and ECQ, and we may need to go back and forth between different levels in different geographic locales based on the conditions. It's like an engineering control system, and you adjust the lockdown level based on data that you get. Back to the GDP profile, we were on a very nice upward trajectory. We expect a dip in 2020 as a result of the pandemic, which we would see on screen. But once the pandemic is over or brought under control, then the economy is expected to spring back, not quite to the level of the 6-7% growth that we enjoyed throughout much of the previous decade, but our resident economist is projecting a level of about 4% to the middle of the next, rather of the current decade. But we're looking conservatively at what may be a very dire economic picture for 2020, with up to 11% contraction compared to the previous year. Next slide, please. What does that spell for the individual, the 16 sectors that we had disaggregated from the IO data? One of the data we can look at would be economic loss, which is how much reduction in output as measured in billions of pesos do we observe in each of these sectors relative to what would have happened had there been no pandemic. And we see here on screen, these are the sectors which are most critical in terms of just sheer economic loss. Another metric we can use is so-called inoperability. This was proposed by Just Santos in his work. Well, he's now with George Washington University. This was done as part of his PhD work almost 20 years ago. Inoperability is a fractional reduction in economic output. And it gives you a different sort of ranking compared to the sheer magnitude of economic loss. And as you can see here, for example, if we look at sector number 6, it doesn't rank very high in terms of the volume of economic loss in billions of pesos. But if you were to look at the inoperability value, it's actually worst off, with suffering about close to 50% inoperability. And this is a significant result because when policymakers develop economic policy, the issue is not just how much economic value is being lost, but is that economic sector going to be able to bounce back after the crisis? And this is highly dependent not just on the size of the economy or the sector, but how far has it deviated from its normal state in terms of percentage or fraction. So looking at both of these metrics, the economic loss and inoperability, would give you better insights on what to do. And in this case, for instance, there is severe impact on coconut-related sectors. Next slide, please. And we take a look at both of these metrics to prioritize financial aid for economic recovery. Next slide, please. One other intervention that we simulated is the infusion of stimulus funds into individual sectors. And in this chart, we show the results of the effect of infusing 10 billion pesos of stimulus funds into each sector individually without infusing funding into any of the other sectors. So for example, if we were to take 10 billion pesos and infuse that into sector one, what happens is, because you have an economic network where the sectors are all interconnected to some degree, that actually results in additional benefits. So we put in 10 billion pesos, but if you look at sector one, which is the leftmost bar, the change in output is about 17 billion pesos. So there's a multiplier effect that results from the infusion. And this is for the total economy. That actually is distributed across different sectors. And the green portion of the bar represents how much of that benefit accrues to the sectors that we flagged as being linked to the coconut agro-industrial supply chain. So once again, we look at both total economy-wide effects and the share that is felt by the coconut industry, which are shown by the green bars in this histogram. And if we were to do that sequentially, if we were to place the 10 billion pesos just in sector two, what results would we get? Here, less benefit to the entire economy, but much more of the lion's share going to the coconut sectors. And we did that sequentially through all 16 sectors to figure out the sensitivity of the responses. Next slide, please. There's actually a stimulus package being discussed now, which is intended to help start up the economy again. This is what we expect the effect to be. So if we show the graphics, next slide, please. Okay, forward, please. Forward, please. This is the stimulus package being discussed, and we would see how that affects. Potentially, we can see some benefits by some reduction in economic losses and some reduction in inoperability of some sectors. It's quite notable that sector 13 actually has a very large benefit in terms of both getting actually increased economic output rather than decreased, and negative inoperability, meaning it gets more value or more economic activity than it would have without the pandemic. The question now is there a way to optimize the stimulus package to get the most bang for the buck, so to speak? So if you look at the next slide. Next slide, please. We combined input-output analysis with operations research, and we set up a mathematical program with the objective of optimizing the allocation of stimulus funds. And we had 4 scenarios. Number 1 is a scenario based on trying to maintain the GDP level from the previous year, which is the total final demand of the economy, without constraining the distribution across the different sectors. And we figured out through this model, we found that the minimum stimulus fund required is 1.4 trillion pesos in order to achieve this goal. And as a matter of fact, the model tells us that all of this 1.4 trillion pesos should be put into the various manufacturing sectors. And the benefits would then accrue to the rest of the economy via ripple effects or via the network linkages within the economic system. We looked at scenario 2, which is a bit more ambitious. We try to maintain the total GDP of 2019 and also maintain the GDP share of each of the sectors. In other words, whereas previously we were looking at just the total, now we were looking at, in scenario 2, looking at each sector maintaining its final demand in 2020. And upon optimization, it turns out that we require almost 2.5 trillion pesos of stimulus funds, with about 10% of this being allocated to the coconut-related sectors. That's both the coconut farming and the downstream agro-industrial sectors, while just under 90% would be distributed throughout the rest of the economy. In scenario 3, we looked at the more ambitious picture of trying to maintain the original 6.5% GDP growth forecast that we had for this year, while maintaining a lower bound of 2019 GDP for each of the individual sectors. This scenario requires almost 2.8 trillion pesos of stimulus funds, of which 8% would have to be distributed to the coconut-related sectors. And the pie chart down here then shows the distribution to the rest of the economy. But 8% goes to coconut industry. Now, these are all very ambitious, so we then decided to look at a more conservative end of the scale, assuming a limited amount of 1.5 trillion pesos of stimulus funds. We imposed a constraint of no more than 10% inoperability for any of the sectors in the economy. And upon optimization, we found out that the constraints imposed would result in a 3.2% contraction of the economy, measured in terms of total GDP. This will require 1.3 trillion pesos of stimulus funds, of which about 16% goes to the agro-industrial sectors linked to the coconut industry. So if we go to the next slide and examine sector 4 more closely, this is the baseline that we're looking at. This is the damage done by the pandemic. If we then show the animation, we would see the mitigation effects of scenario 4. So forward, please, so that we can see the results. That's the 10% inoperability constraint. And as you can see, by imposing the inoperability limit, the red line, which was the original uncontrolled scenario, shifts upward, and we have the dotted green line, which shows the resulting inoperability upon infusion of the stimulus funds into the various sectors of the economy. Oh, next slide, please. So that concludes the Philippine picture. And what we see is that it is actually possible to calibrate the stimulus package distribution based on knowledge of the linkages of the different sectors of the economy. And of course, it is possible to prioritize sectors based on either inoperability or based on the economic loss from the uncontrolled scenario or based on criticality. And it turns out that it is possible to have, it would need as much as 2.8 trillion pesos to maintain the initial GDP forecast, which may be unrealistic. Scenario 4 is the damage control scenario, where we limit 10% inoperability and would require just about half of the previous scenario's stimulus funds. Next up, of course, it's important to note that this is generic methodology, and you can take any country and apply this to their data. And let's have a look at the Malaysian scenario to be discussed by Professor Denny Ng, so that we can look at a comparison of these two countries and look for common features as well as contrasting effects. So that concludes my part.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Tan. Okay, Denny, would you like me to share the slides, or will you share it from your end?
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I've shared my screen. Do you able to see?
Okay, yes, we can see it. Okay, you may proceed.
I will proceed. Right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Professor Raymond Tan, for the brief introductions or detailed discussions about the case that we have done for Philippines, focusing on coconut. In Malaysia, our major agro-industry is palm oil. So I will take this opportunity to share some of the results that we have done on looking at the similar model that we developed, application in the palm oil industry in Malaysia. So we actually following the same model that we have developed, or the methodology. We actually, based on Malaysia input-output model, we identified 15 sectors. And you can see that we categorize them into agri, mining, manufacturing, constructions, and services. And the highlighted in green is the industry that is related, or the sectors that is related to the palm oil, which are the I2, the sector 2, sector 4, Sector 5, and Sector 6. The 4, 5, 6 are mainly on the downstream of the palm oil. After the extraction of the crude palm oil, we send for the refinery to produce various palm-based products. So again, we actually analyze the sectors criticality index, SEI, for all the sectors. And then we follow the sector 1 to sector 15, following the same approach that we have done for the Philippine case study. So we rearrange them. One of the interesting notes that I would like to share here is we also having the same sectors, which is same with Philippines, whereby the other manufacturing sectors rank number 1. However, we have slightly different observations for the palm oil sectors. You can notice that I4, which is the industry sectors 4, sector 2, sector 5, and sector 6 are really palm oil related sectors. They are also ranked less critical comparing to the government services or the manufacturing sectors. And they are mainly ranked number 8, 9, 11, and 14. So we analyze a similar behavior, or what are the impact on the sectors when this pandemic has started, or actually if without any control systems or similar package that we introduce from the government, what is going to impact on our current situations. And you can notice that the which is the sector 6, which causes the most sector 7 causes the most economic losses, followed by sector 11 and sector 15. So this is the sectors that we look at the criticality just now. We have shown you in the graph previously, and to show that this is the 3 sectors that most impacted economically. We also look at Inoperability that just has same approach. And one of the observations that we obtain is the sector number 4 is actually achieving 25% of reductions in the Inoperability. And we can look at that. Palm oil, or the agriculture's industry, which is the sector 4 and sector 2, Inoperability. So you can observe that a lot, although that we have not noticed, there's no direct economic impact or huge economic impact loss in the agro-industry. Unfortunately, it actually caused huge inoperability issues in the palm oil sectors. So I just do the comparisons here, what happened in the Philippines and Malaysia. Philippines actually declared the lockdown since 15th of March until present. However, in Malaysia, we started on the 18th of March. We finished our, we call it control movement order in June 9th. And then we move into the recovery phase now until 31st of August. We estimate the reductions of the GDP in Philippines is 5.71. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, we are expected about 3.1. The reasons is, I think, because the Philippines, they are still rising on the COVID-19 cases. Meanwhile, Malaysia, we have start declining into a single digit in the past few days. Therefore, a lot of economic activity has been resumed in Malaysia. We would like to see there is a bounce back in the GDP increase, or it's not significantly impact comparing to the Philippines situations. So, but one of the interesting notes that I would like to share here is other manufacturing are the most critical sectors regardless of Malaysia or Philippines. Their behavior is same. But for the Philippines, the second rank is actually trading government, then followed by the private sectors. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, we will be impacted on the government, then followed by the trading and the private sectors. So there's slightly rank between the sectors. Therefore, what the country government, each country government will do a different kind of a similar package. So what is the most critical impacted in each country? So we had the Philippine cases where petroleum refinery, construction and trade. However, in Malaysia, the very obvious impacted critical affected sectors are the oil and fats manufacturing, palm oil and trading. So what we have a similar package that we really introduced by our government. In Philippines, we have 381 billion peso. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, we have 21.6 billion ringgit to be introduced. And with that, because we actually pay a lot of attention on our agro industry, we noted that in Philippines, there's none allocated directly or indirectly to coconut related sectors. However, in Malaysia, we still have small portion of the civil package that directly introduced into the palm oil industry. Although Malaysia actually identified as the most critical affected by palm oil, but we only get a share of 0.9%. Based on that, using our model that we developed, the input-output model with the operational strategies research that we have introduced, the optimization model that we developed, we observed that in order for us to really bring back the economic performance of the sectors, in Philippines, we are talking about 1.3 trillion of pesos required, which contribute 15.7% to be allocated in the coconut industry. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, we actually have to increase from 21.6 billion to 66.5 billion. We are 37% or more, slightly more, to be allocated in the palm oil, so that we were able to achieve the minimum inoperability of 10% for each sectors, while maintaining the GDP of the previous. So as a conclusion, our team, we will be pleased to share with you that we have developed techniques based on the economic input-output models that account for the network effects across the sectors. So we are studying on the interconnectivity of the sectors, and then taking all the 5 metrics or the measurements, inclusive of the employability, the economic, and so on and so forth, to analyze the criticality of each sectors. The techniques able to prioritize for us how do we invest or rescue all the sectors, and then through the direct and indirect infusions of the funds to the different sectors, we are able to bring back the government or the country economy or GDP in the coming years. Based on the result, you noted that manufacturing sectors is always determined as the most critical sectors of both countries. Reasons being our countries are still focusing very much on manufacturers. In Malaysia in particularly, we have more than 60% of our industry are SMEs, small and medium industry, where they are focusing very much on the manufacturing. So therefore, the government, the whole country GDP is actually contributed quite significantly from the manufacturing sectors. And based on the model that we developed, we have an effective post-lockdown exit strategy to revive the economics during the pandemic or COVID-19 pandemic. So we managed to generate some scenarios, and you can see that from the Philippine case study, we analyzed various scenarios to look at what is the impact if we do nothing. We have then some of the sectors might be naturally uncompetitive and they close down, and then they will create other issues whereby the Inoperability, and so on and so forth. So we have to have came up with an effective exit strategy so that we can bounce back to our normal GDP or get back to the reasonable amount of GDP that we achieve in the coming years. So at the end of this presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering for hosting the webinar today. And then we also like to thank Young Scientist Network and Academic Sciences Malaysia, YSN ASM, for being our partners to be hosting our webinar next week in Malaysia to contact with all the stakeholders and then to look at Malaysia case study in more details. And finally, I would like to thank the project funders, Herald Global Challenge Research Fund, for all the funding supports for this work. So these are all the references that we have used, mainly on the input-output model from the Philippines, Malaysia, Department of Statistics Malaysia, and some data from the World Economic Forum and the others. So I'd like to pause here on time. If you have any question, feel free to ask. We are happy to answer all the questions that you have. Thank you very much. Kay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Danny Ng. Okay, so thank you so much for those presentations, although I'm also part of the team. Okay, so we'll entertain some questions, and of course, we have our lead economist with us today to address some of those questions very much related to the economy. Okay, so we have viewers also on YouTube, and one of the questions is that what would be the assumed political economy situation, and how does the said agro-industry sector, coconut for the Philippines and palm oil for Malaysia, will be managed in those specific scenarios?
Okay, so good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Let's not talk about the political side, because that's a different animal. Well, let's just deal with the numbers here. So what we've done is to consider the different scenarios if more money will be put into the other sectors so that we can maintain our economic growth or targets, right? But what we can take away from our simulations are, first, on the agri-industrial side, is that coconut and palm oil are very established supply chains in the Philippines and Malaysia. So what we would recommend is for government to also develop other agricultural products, because the weather in Malaysia and the Philippines really is conducive for agricultural development. And this actually boosts our food security. And so if you've noticed in recent news articles, you would hear about farmers throwing out agricultural produce because they couldn't sell. So there are ways for us to upscale or increase the returns to these farmers by training them, providing training to increase the value. Like, from instead of selling raw tomatoes, they can make canned tomatoes or pasta sauces, which would increase their revenue or profits. And then, yeah, so that's it.
Okay, thank you for that, Krista. Anyone from the team would like to add on to that? Okay, so maybe I'll do a follow-up question first for Krista. Okay, so considering the current stimulus package that has been provided by the government, can you at least enlighten us on what are the good things about what the government is doing, and how perhaps they can further improve, or how should they maybe what are the next steps, like that we might be looking at in the coming months?
Okay, so I can only speak for the Philippines.
Yeah.
Maybe Jenny can give inputs for Malaysia.
Yes, yes.
But we have a program, a comprehensive program on this. It's called PH Progreso, or Philippine Program for Recovery with Equity and Solidarity. So it has 4 pillars. And the first one is for emergency support of vulnerable groups. So this is where the wage subsidies, um, the SAP, Social Amelioration Program, comes in. And that's already 600 billion pesos. And then the others, the second pillar is the resource to fight COVID. So these are the health equipment and PPEs, etc. And then last, third pillar, you have the fiscal and monetary actions. And bulk of this goes into the infrastructure development. And lastly, the fourth is a recovery plan. And the total cost of this entire PH Progressive program is 1.743 billion. So if you go back to our slides earlier, we talked about the Philippine stimulus package being just 381 billion. So why is that? Where is the difference coming from? We only focused our energies, or the stimulus package in our simulation as those that can be classified into the different sectors. So the 600 billion pesos that went into the social amelioration plan program is not included because it goes directly to the informal sectors, which are not part of the GDP. And then uh, most of the sorry, most of the efforts actually, for example, in agriculture, is full directed towards the uh, rice sector. So most, I think around 16 billion pesos was directed, 16 billion out of 19 billion went to the rice industry. We understand that rice is very important in the Philippines. However, there are other crops that also need attention. So if we could expand our coverage, then that would be better. Also for the other programs. So I think we lack support. Also, if we want to, we can tie the social amelioration packages with employment so that um, there's people are encouraged to work. The We need to maintain their employment until we can tide over this pandemic. Once they lose their jobs, once businesses start closing down, which is what's happening right now, then we start having a problem. How do we encourage these businesses to restart once we open up? So one of the good points is the government encouraged financial institutions to extend loans, give more opportunities for MSMEs so that they could maintain. However, it may not be enough because we can see that a lot of these small businesses have started closing down.
Okay, thank you. What about for the Malaysian side? Does anyone want to comment? Denny or Viknesh?
All right. I will try to address the question first, then Vignesh can top up based on that. In Malaysia government, we actually launched a few times of the stimulate package just to cover up or to fight back the COVID-19. There are various approach that we came in. I just want to touch base on one of this launched by 250 billion second economic package, whereby we allocated into four measures. One is the 128 billion is used to protect the we call it citizens welfare, rakyat welfare, where they give out some stipends to the eligibility the citizens who are eligible. And then they also invested 100 billion to support the small and medium enterprise, whereby, as I mentioned just now, more than 60% of the industry or manufacturing sectors in the country are SMEs. Therefore, the government identified them as the primary or the backbones of the economy in the country. Therefore, they receive some of the supports. and the other part will be 2 billion will be using as strengthen the economic country economics. So what they do in the country is they provide support to the direct injections of funds to the citizens. Is mainly to relax their living expenses. And then we also working with a lot of banking industry, whereby deferment of repayment of our loans. We have such a schemes for repayment deferment for 6 months, and then now the parliament is actually looking into whether the deferment will be extended or it will not.
Did I lose Danny?
Yeah. So there are quite a lot of package that we have introduced by the government to rescuing the economic in the country. So our what you call Central Bank of Malaysia also dropped twice of our interest rate just to boost up the economy in the country. So maybe Vignesh, if you have anything to add, please feel free.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I think Danny has touched on a lot of important points, but I'll just add one particular point related to that. I think the Malaysian stimulus package as well, they actually did also focus on the manufacturing sector. And one thing I like to highlight about this is that this is actually consistent with our results that we got from our project here, because our project actually identified the manufacturing sectors as also a critical sector. So it's actually quite consistent with what the Malaysian government is actually rolling out at the present time. But of course, that would very much depend on, of course, how they roll out and how much time does it need in order to take the full effect. So in that sense, yeah, in that that is the one thing I can add about the stimulus package related to Malaysia.
Sorry, thank you for that, Danny and Vignesh. So let's move on to the next question from Mike. So thank you so much for the insights on the possible path to post-pandemic recovery in the agro-industrial sector. What I noticed with this pandemic is that it revealed the weak or fragile agri-food supply chain. In this regard, with the proposed method, can the proposed method be extended to provide policy recommendations to address such faulty structure? How could you relate a resilient agri-food supply chain to the sector criticality and vulnerability index mentioned in the study? So who would like to take up that particular question?
I'll take a crack at that
Okay.
question. Our colleague, Professor Mike Promentilla, of course, is in the heart of coconut country in the Philippines. So hello down there. I hope things are okay in our home province, Quezon province. Last month, there was a webinar in this series by Joel Coelho on reconfiguring food supply chains by bringing the farms closer to the cities via, for example, indoor farming and such technologies. I think, how does our technique fit in? Input-output analysis is a top-down modeling technique. And Leontiev himself said it's by nature a historical document, because you look at last year's data and then construct the input-output table from that. And it's low resolution in the sense that you get a bird's eye view of the economy. On the other hand, the use of reconfigured supply chains is an engineering problem. It's bottom up, and what you would do is actually engineer the building blocks of the technology and fit them into a workable supply chain, as was described in the webinar that I referred to. I think what can be done, it should be possible to have a hybrid approach where these proposed new supply chain configurations can be used to retrofit a statistical input-output table. In other words, you'd get the data from the government office, and then you would change the figures to reflect a supply chain configuration that you are considering to implement. What we've done with our indices is you can actually measure the potential effects of those changes before you begin making the changes. In other words, you would be able to tinker with different scenarios. If I do this, how would the criticality change? If I do something else, how would that change? And this is where mathematical models such as this are sort of like crystal balls where you can see into the future and make smarter decisions because you can simulate different futures and finally commit to the best one that your model identifies. So I hope that answers at least partly your question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so the next question comes from Michael Francis Benjamin. So how long until we actually achieve the desired GDPs after infusing the financial stimulus? Okay, Viknesh? Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. This is a very good question as well. And in fact, we, as part of the team, we actually discussed this point that was raised in the question. To answer the question, we look at it as from our results that we obtained in this project. What we're actually recommending is actually what do we need to get to where we want to be. But the how will be very much dependent on how the governments in the respective countries in the Philippines and Malaysia it would depend on how they plan to roll out this stimulus package or the future stimulus packages as we noted earlier. So we provide the numbers as to what is required for us to achieve a certain economic output in the future. But in terms of how it's going to be done, how long it's going to take, it very much depends on the resources available to the government and the accessibility and a lot of various factors which we would need to consider as well. So at this point, we've only considered what we need in order to get there. Yeah.
Let
I
me
think
add
Raymond wants to,
something.
yeah.
Yeah, let me add something to this point. This is really a very tough question, and a lot of it depends on how long the pandemic will persist, and it's really outside of the expertise of any of the team members to figure out whether COVID will persist for 12 more months or 18 more months and so on. So I'll speak in terms of the engineering side and comment on what is good, what's worse about COVID compared to other disasters that we have experienced historically. On the one hand, the good thing about this crisis, unlike having a large earthquake or typhoons, is there is no physical damage to economic assets, if you think about it. If an airline goes bankrupt, the planes are largely intact. And if there was an infusion of funds and enough market for it, you could essentially, with a bit of refurbishment and maintenance, restart those planes quite quickly, unlike if there was actual physical damage to facilities and you would have to physically rebuild production capacity. So that's one difference. On the downside, of course, the pandemic has this, is not localized, unlike storms. When we regularly have storms passing through the Philippines and you'd have a severe damage, but geographically isolated in specific provinces. While this pandemic, of course, is essentially all over the country, in fact, all over the world, and thus is more distributed. And in that sense, there is less capability to transfer economic activities to more secure locations, because eventually the virus will eventually get to you at some point. So that's not quite a direct answer to your question, but those are the considerations when we try to think of how long it will take to bounce back. Final note might be we can learn some lessons from the Spanish flu more than 100 years ago as to give us a ballpark figure of how long it will take to bounce back from a major contagion like this contagion event. So maybe a couple of years is my guesstimate, but as a non-expert.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's take another questions from the YouTube channel. So this one comes from Angeline Lau. Can validation of the model be performed? If yes, how? Who would like to respond to that particular question?
Well, let me take a
Yeah,
crack
Raymond
at that.
again.
I've had 2 decades of answering questions about validation of models. And it's really very tricky because this is a real world natural experiment taking place. And unlike a lab setup where you can run a control and you can run an experiment with the actual intervention and compare the results, the alternative is never observable in real life. I hope that is, that's a very subtle point, but when you make a policy shift, for example, if you were to go to a counterfactual argument about what would have happened if we tightened or relaxed the lockdowns a bit differently? Would we have more cases now or fewer cases? Would there be less damage on the economy? And once you change that path, you really can never observe the alternative. So in that sense, when we have mathematical models of entire economies, validation is indirect. Number one is we have to have very tight quality assurance on the assumptions. In other words, we want to make sure that the model is internally self-consistent so that it has correct logic as it does the simulations. And in fact, the only other way I know of to do proper validation of a mathematical model is retrospectively. This is done, for instance, when we have climate simulations to project what happens to a global mean temperature in the future. What you would do is travel back in time and try to simulate the present from the past. And if you get reasonable results, then you have a bit of confidence that you can then simulate the future from the present using the same computing framework. So that kind of retrospective validation can be done. And this might be something, that's a good point. This might be something we should do as part of this, a follow-up of this project. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Viknesh.
Yeah, I think I'll add on as well. I think another point for validation is when we're using models or developing models such as this, I think one key actor is the data that we get. So if the data is accurate, then of course that goes a long way for us as well. And in that sense, for us, we are actually using data from the Department of Statistics in Malaysia, as well as the counterpart in the Philippines as well. So that's a good starting point for us because we're using data that is published, that is available, and that has already been, screened through as well by the relevant departments and agencies as well. So that's a good starting point in terms of sort of inherently validating the results that we're getting. So that's the point I'd like to add. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Danny.
Okay, go on.
Yep. I may share also some of the things that we can do. Like mentioned by Raymond just now, input-output model, or the model that we develop at the moment, is very bird view. It's actually a very big development for the country, simulating the country for the future. I was fortunate to involve in quite a number of a project under the Academic Science Malaysia, whereby we had drafted the country policy. So when we involve in the policy development, a lot of the things that we have done, or what we envision ourselves in the next 10 years or 20 years, how it will recover, is mainly based on the expert experience. At the same time, is what we want to achieve. So it's setting a mission and visions for ourselves, then we drive ourselves towards the directions. So I think the simulation or the model that we develop is mainly to give us an idea what is going to be and look like if we do whatever we have done now. Again, it may deviate. Again, for example, when I was young, we were having a Vision 2020. We feel like we're having a flying cars in Malaysia, although we are trying to, but unfortunately we fail. There are a lot of development, become a developed country 30 years ago. But because of all the crises, all the uncertainty that we came in, the country has not able to achieve whatever we have envisioned. But again, it's something that we set upon. Every citizen is trying to go towards the same directions. On the other notes is, as we mentioned, this is a very big upward view. There are some validation or some of the things that we can do is the locality or the significance of the each sectors. For example, I have a long discussion with my team yesterday when we said, okay, palm oil is impacted 25% are inoperability based on the index of measure that we have simulated or we measured. I have to ensure that the answer, the 25%, is reflective of what happened in the ground. Because in Malaysia, when we started about discussing all this, palm oil are not listed as the control movement order, because we say palm oil is the primary or important food supply chain. So the government actually relaxed the palm oil mills and the plantation to continue operate, although the other sectors are shut down. So with that kind of perception in place, then when we say 25% inoperability, is it something reflective to the reality? People will say, no, maybe not. Why? Because I have still working, everyone is still working, still producing power. Why is actually 25% immobility in this case? So after a discussion, we actually identify saying that what we notice at the end is the reduction of demand. Indirectly, the exports has decreased in China and India. This is the main exports country that we have. Because of the export had declined, at the same time also reductions of the price of palm oil. That actually impact the drop of the economic performance of the palm oil industry. And based on all this analysis in detail on each sectors, we are able to validate the model that we generated. The 25% is representative because we know actually in the ground, it happened. Although people will say, no, not 25% of people losing job. No, that's not the answer, but it's 25% of the efficiency has decreased because of the productivity have dropped, the demand has dropped, and so on and so forth. So I think that is a good discussion that we had, and then I think that is the good representative that we had done based on the results.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Danny, and the others. Okay, since Danny mentioned that he's very much in discussion with some of the stakeholders in Malaysia. So this is a follow-up question in YouTube by Rodelio Sobade. So how do you intend to communicate your results to government, considering that there are, for the 25 million people who are dependent on the Philippine coconut industry, and maybe the same, more or less, a lot of people also that are associated with the palm oil industry. So from the Philippine team, may I know who wants to address
Maybe I
that
can
particular?
start first from Malaysia,
Okay, all
then we
right,
can give a
Malaysia team.
bit time
Okay,
for the Philippines.
go, Danny.
Right, thanks. We had, I would say one of the output of this project is engagement with the policyholders. I would say we are a bit fortunate to manage to get Young Scientist Network and Academic Science Malaysia on board to work with us to disseminate our results or the model that we developed. And therefore, on the next coming Friday, we actually already organized an webinar to engage with all the stakeholders of majority of the main important palm oil stakeholders in Malaysia, including of the Ministry of Agriculture, including of all the agency which is related to palm oil, include Malaysia Palm Oil Board, Malaysia Palm Oil Council, and then and quite a number of NGO, WWF, and so on and so forth, who are interested on palm oil. And just fortunate that I'm part of the Malaysia Sustainable Palm Oil certifications technical committee. I know quite a number of them. Actually, I invited most of them. They're actually happy to be part of this. So with their input and they understand the output of this result, we hope that they can bring it back to their respective society to carry out, to discuss, and to talk about all these initiatives that we should have. Because every time before the government announcing of any all this support or similar package, they actually conducted a consultations with the respective stakeholders. So the moment we can share with all these activities, all these results with this respective stakeholders, they can be sending the right voice to the policymakers. At the same time, SM is very influential. I would say they are playing a very important role in national policy making process. Most of the time, ministry, before they make any recommendations, they always go back to Academic Science Malaysia to conduct some certain study. So we are working very closely with Academic Science Malaysia. So I believe that kind of result will be able to translate to the policy in the near future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Denny. Yeah, so I just want to clarify the academic sciences in Malaysia. Is it similar to the National Academy of Science and Technology in the Philippines? Raymond, maybe you can respond to that.
Yes, ASM is the counterpart of NAST in the Philippines.
Okay, and would you like
And
to answer on
likewise,
behalf of the Philippines? Yeah.
well, I'll answer as an academic and not representing any particular organization. In general, our role is to come up with these insights and ideas, and we have two outlets. One is a scientific outlet, and where we target to get our work published in a scientific journal. But nowadays, of course, it's also important, especially for an issue such as COVID, it's important to get the same information and package it differently and aim it at a different audience, which might include non-specialists, but might include people who would actually use the information to make policies. And this webinar is part of that effort. The reason we're doing webinars in both countries, although the geographic locale actually doesn't count if it's a webinar, but this is part of the effort. What we will also do is we'll continue to engage colleagues in contacts in media and government, probably write up a policy-oriented brief about our results and send those to various government agencies that may or may not be able to use the information. And the final point about this is, in academia, our role is really to get our science right and make the recommendations as best we can. It's not really our role to make the decisions or policies for the people. It's for us to come up with correct answers and hope that the information is used properly to make decisions that affect the constituencies of entire governments.
Sorry. Thank you for that. I was muted. We have another question. This one comes from Giselle. So Giselle is in the audience in Zoom. Can you compare and analyze the major differences in the on-the-ground engineering manufacturing technologies used in coconut and palm oil industries in the Philippines and Malaysia, which may spell the difference of impact of any economic stimulus? What new advanced fundamental technologies would you recommend aside from indoor urban farming that the government should support? What is technological training of MSMEs and the cost required for this one? Who would like to respond? Okay, Raymond, go.
Since I'm familiar with both industries, having grown up,
being
having
50% Malaysian.
Well, I visited a few palm oil mills, but I actually grew up in a coconut oil mill, literally for, that was a small family business back in the day. Even though the trees look the same from a distance, the actual process of making the two oils are very different. To summarize very quickly, in the coconut industry, the oil-bearing part of the coconut is separated from all of the biomass, the husk and the shell is separated in the farm, and it's only the copra, the dried meat, which contains the oil, that is shipped to the various refineries where it's mechanically pressed to squeeze out the oil and then refined thereafter. And the refining, of course, looks the same for both of these sectors. The palm oil mill, the palm oil industry is a bit different because what happens, it's the entire fruit which is taken from the plantations and brought to the palm oil mills, and that's where all the biomass is stripped away from the oil-bearing part of the fruit, which is I forget what it's called, but it's there are two parts of the fruit which are oil-bearing, and that gives you both palm oil on one hand, and then the palm kernel itself can then be a source of palm kernel oil. But it also means that because of the way the supply chain works, all of that waste biomass is consolidated in the plant and is actually available for use for various downstream industrial products. Unlike in the Philippines, all the biomass is left behind, dispersed in the farms. And this is a major logistical difference because For example, Denny and of course Viknesh, when he was a PhD student, did plenty of work on biorefineries where you would take these waste biomass from palm oils and use it as a raw material to make chemicals and high value products. Because it's already there in huge piles in these palm oil mills. In the Philippines, if there's a bit of a logistical difficulty, because if we were to try to do this, it would entail a second step of having a supply chain to take all of that waste biomass, the shell and the husk, and then transporting them to factories where you could make high value products out of them. So that's a major challenge. In terms of scale as well, the business and economic side of it is in Malaysia. There's plenty of economies of scale. These palm oil mills are typically much larger than our coconut mills. Likewise, the plantation firms are also typically very large, and there's plenty of vertical integration. While in the Philippines, for example, because of land reform, we'd have smaller plantation sizes. And in that case, we probably have not been able to optimize the yields. A final statistical note, 1/10 of the Philippines land area is coconut plantation area. But in terms of the output, it doesn't compare to the oil output from palm, which is much more intensively cultivated in countries such as Malaysia.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'll move on to hopefully the last question. Okay, so this is from May Lim. It was posted on YouTube. So demand is currently suppressed because of fewer restaurants being open and thus less demand for oil. How much role does storage and the possible lack of it due to non-use of products affect the model? Okay, yes, okay, Viknesh.
Yeah, perhaps I could put my inputs into this question, and then perhaps the rest of the team also can chip in as well. What our model actually looks at is actually one of the things is, of course, the economic output itself. So how it actually translates down to the lowest resolution, that is something that, of course, has to be planned further, in fact. So that is like, I would say, another deeper level optimization and decision making that needs to be done. From our standpoint, from at least the top-down point of view or perspective, is more on just sort of recommending or sort of telling people that this is what the performance of that sector is looking into or currently performing at this point. But in terms of the storage, like what the question asked, that is a detail that we have not looked into at this point, because that is going to another level in which we have to look into. Yeah. But of course, the rest can
Yes,
join in as
okay.
well.
Thank you for that, Viknesh. Any additional inputs from the rest?
Just one quick point. Input-output models are snapshot models of economies in the sense that price effects are not present in the model. There's the assumption of fixed prices of goods. Now, this is actually, this is an assumption which skews the results of input-output models because, let me give an example. Back in March or April, at one point, there were places on Earth where the price of petroleum became negative for exactly the same reason that you mentioned. And that is a price effect because the drop in demand changes the price, and there's a complex feedback between the market response to the drop in price and such. And there's actually a modeling technique which is based on IO, but sort of IO on steroids, if you will. CGE, it's a computable general equation, general equilibrium modeling, which integrates such price effects. But that has been, given the 2-month time frame of our study, the emergency nature of the work, we decided that the approximations that we can get from IO would be sufficient to gain at least some insights on how to best manage the crisis. Always with a view towards declaring the assumptions and limitations of the modeling techniques that we use.
Okay, so thank you. I think we've exhausted all of the questions. Yeah, there was one question. They wanted to know if you'd be willing to share a copy of the slides as well as a document, maybe the paper, the final paper, to some of our viewers. So maybe may I know who the viewers should contact or communicate with to get
Well,
information?
I'll say one other thing. And because this work, we're preparing a peer-reviewed, a manuscript for peer review. And what we're seeing now is the major commercial publishers make COVID-related papers
Mm-hmm.
open access, free to the public, even if you don't have a subscription. So it's a matter of waiting for that paper to be written up and submitted and peer reviewed and eventually published. And we'll probably post a link in all the institutions involved. We'll post a link which will allow free access to the manuscript.
Okay, thank you. And before we close, maybe I'd like to ask Vitnesh, since you're the project lead of this particular project, what would be the next steps, and what are you looking at as a follow up on this particular study?
Okay, thanks, Kate. There's two important things I'd like to mention. Firstly, of course, we have already conducted our webinar here for the Philippines side. Now, in the next week, next Friday, we'll be meeting the stakeholders in Malaysia and then presenting our results more focused on the Malaysia side as well and getting inputs and feedback from them. But of course, in the long term for this project as well. So we're not just doing this for the sake of doing a project. We're looking at this thing in a more long term because, of course, and that's actually the second point I'm going to bring up as well later on. But the focus here is, of course, to work with policymakers to write policy briefs, and then, of course, to get more involved in policy making. And this project is a stepping stone for us to do that. In fact, another thing that we're planning to look at is something that is already in the works that we're going to start off. We have, I think, the data to kick us off in this direction is also to look at the corresponding greenhouse gas emissions resulting from this
Mm-hmm.
case or from this pandemic as well. So, I mean, of course, it's going to be controversial if I say that, yeah, the pandemic has reduced our carbon emissions. But I would say that it's more of this pandemic actually has given us some lessons. And one of these lessons could be is that uh, judging by how we have operated our economic system as a whole, how would we obtain or target carbon reductions accordingly, or how can we bring in impact towards the carbon emissions and in our fight to reduce carbon emissions. So of course, yes, the pandemic is bad on its own, but the lessons that we get out of it is that in some sectors perhaps we could have operated from maybe working from home, but yet we still drive to work, you see. So this is just some of the examples of the lessons that we could get from this, and that is going to be something that we're looking at the corresponding GHG emissions and also other objectives as well in the project as well. But another additional point that I was going to say is that I hope that this webinar is a very useful starting point, not just for us as the project members, but for those listening in through the Zoom platform and also those who are listening in on YouTube. First of all, thank you very much for your questions. Really helpful, very useful questions, and in fact, very good for stimulating discussion as well. And a second thing is also, I'm hoping that this stimulates more discussions and as well as more potential collaborations. What I would like to use this opportunity here is to sort of make a declaration that we are welcoming, collaborations further. If you are working in this similar area or intend to work in this area, please feel free to get in touch with us, because we're not just looking at this as a project, we're looking at this as something that we could contribute to the world, in fact. And whether regardless of Malaysia, regardless of the Philippines, at the end of the day, we are one human race, and the fight is it's our fight. All right. So even though in Malaysia we are in the recovery phase, but at the end of the day, we are all still one human race, right? So in that sense, some of you may wonder, you're not on the front line, you're not fighting this pandemic directly, but of course, some of us who are in the back line, I use the term the back line, right? Providing support. And one way we can provide support is put the science, put the engineering, put the research into the places that it needs to be, so that we could work together and come up with good solutions. And I think this is a good starting point for that. So by all means, we highly welcome collaborations and to extend this work even further as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Viknesh. Before we close the session, let me just share my screen to plug the activities of PAASE in the succeeding days, succeeding weeks. Okay, so hold on. Okay, so we're done with this one today. So starting Monday, so July 20, all the way to August 14. Hold on, let me just check. Okay, all the way to August 14, we will be celebrating the 40th PAASE anniversary and the 2020 annual PAASE meeting and symposium. So we will be having sessions every day from 8 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock Philippine Standard Time. So if you want to have a look at the program, you can scan this QR code and it will direct you to the link for the entire program. But I'd like to plug the very first session that we will be having, which is on Monday. So this is the opening plenary session. So you can find the link if you want to register. Please go to the program link, and all the information will be there, and you can actually click on the individual sessions so that you can register yourself, or if you're interested to watch it via YouTube, the YouTube links are also there. Maybe I can invite Giselle to say something. So Giselle is the current president of the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering. So Giselle, would you have any words for our participants today?
Thank you, Kay, for the opportunity to talk about 40th APAMS. But before I do that, I'd like to strongly recommend that the DLSU team led by Raymond Tan convey your modeling results to the NEDA and the Department of Agriculture. And we should try best to help you with that, Raymond. So congratulations on your work. Now, Raymond will be one of our plenary speakers on July 22, but our opening session is on July 20, that's Monday, and it's on the topic of COVID-19, which the PAASE, the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering, tried best to address with early responses as early as March. So at this first session, we will have a panel discussion of our PAASE members who are newly elected to the National Academy of Science and Technology. Then we will have as our keynote speaker the former secretary of the NEDA, National Economic Development Authority, who is a honorary chair of this 40th APAM celebration. And then we will have Paula Borromeo of the Ayala Health Group to talk about the integrated measures that his company, the Ayala conglomerate, took to try to get their employees back to work. So I think Ayala Health is a good example of how major industry involved in a lot of manufacturing, telecommunications, real estate, etc., has been very proactive in taking steps to contain COVID and getting the economy contributed by the private sector back on its feet. So I'd like to thank our speakers and participants from outside the Philippines, the Malaysian team. There's so much that we can learn from you regarding using advanced technologies and systems, other economic and industrial systems to improve the production of oil, in our case, coconut oil and other products from coconut. There's so much that needs to be done as far as the coconut industry is concerned in the Philippines. So thank you very much, Kay, for this opportunity. And if you share the whole scientific program, you'll see that there's everything. There's something for everyone in the program. We have over 200 presentations by Filipinos who live in the Philippines, in the United States, and elsewhere in the world. There will be posters by our undergraduate and graduate students, and it's just telling you that the scientific life in the Philippines is growing with everyone's contributions. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Giselle. So I hope that you guys can join
Thank you very
us.
much, Giselle.
So I hope that you guys can join us in the celebration of the 40th PAASE anniversary. Okay, so again, so we are present in Facebook. You can find us at yeah, in our official PAASE Facebook page. We also have our webpage, which is at paase.org, and the webinars that we are hosting. So the recordings will be posted in our YouTube channel, which is at bit.ly/PAASE webinars. Okay. Okay, so that's it for us this morning. So if there's nothing else, thank you again for joining us. Because of the celebration of PAASE, the webinars will be on hold, but we have the PAASE anniversary sessions that you can join. So thank you again, everyone, and see you in our future webinars. Bye, guys.